The Craven fleet commander made his first mistake before he fired a single shot, and his mistake was the same mistake everyone made about Farron Station, which was looking at it and seeing exactly what it appeared to be. A small, unremarkable outpost on the wrong end of nowhere. 43 human personnel, minimal power signature. No warships within 6 hours at best speed. The kind of posting that existed in every spacefaring civilization's frontier infrastructure, and that meant, in the universal language of military assessment, low value, low threat, low priority, easy target, and Veth Salas had been raiding human installations for 11 years and had learned exactly one thing about humans in that time, which was that they bled the same as everything else when you hit them hard enough and fast enough. And so he looked at his sensor data on Farron Station and saw 43 humans on a rock in the middle of deep space, and felt the specific satisfaction of a man who has already calculated the outcome and found it acceptable. And he gave the order to advance. And he had no idea, none at all, that somewhere inside that unremarkable outpost, a woman named Dara Akafer had just looked at her own sensor display, seen his fleet coming, and said one word to her entire station over the internal comm. Just one word, and that word was stations. And every single person who heard it and knew what it meant felt their blood go cold, not from fear of what was coming, but from the specific, clarifying knowledge of what was about to happen to it. Private First Class Tamaz Reyes had been at Farron Station for 6 weeks and had not yet figured out what it actually was. He had orders that said mining and research support, had a bunk assignment and a duty roster, and a commanding officer who signed his forms without much conversation. And he had spent 6 weeks watching 42 other people go about their days with a kind of quiet competence that didn't quite match the posting, that didn't quite match the equipment in the lower levels that nobody had given him clearance to fully inventory, that didn't quite match the way Master Sergeant Akafer stood in the observation bay sometimes at 0300 and looked at the star field the way a person looks at something they are patiently waiting for rather than the way a person looks at something they are simply watching. And he had cataloged all of these small wrongnesses without being able to organize them into a conclusion. Because he was 22 years old and 3 months out of advanced infantry training, and his frame of reference for what a classified Tier 1 installation disguised as a civilian research outpost looked like was precisely 0. And so, when the internal comm crackled and Akafer's voice came through with that single word, stations, Reyes looked at the soldier in the bunk across from him. A staff sergeant named Priya Mehta, who had been at Farron for 4 years, and whose service record showed a long string of administrative reassignments that Reyes had looked up once out of curiosity and found blandly uninformative. And Mehta was already on her feet pulling on her duty gear with a speed and economy of motion that Reyes associated with people who have done a thing so many times it no longer requires thought. And Mehta looked at him and said, in the flat voice of someone communicating a fact rather than an instruction, "Get your gear and follow me. Don't ask questions until there's time for them." And there was something in her voice that told Reyes the asking questions until there's time for them part was not a suggestion, and he got his gear. The corridor outside the bunk room was already full of movement, people going to positions with a directional certainty that told Reyes everyone here knew exactly where they were supposed to be, and exactly what was supposed to happen when they got there. And he followed Mehta through 3 corridor junctions to a secondary operations room he had been in twice before for orientation briefings, and found it already occupied by 8 people running consoles that had not been active in any of his 6 weeks here. Screens cycling through data he didn't have the context to fully read, and at the center of the room, standing in front of the main display with her hands loose at her sides, was Master Sergeant Dara Akafer, and she was looking at a sensor return that showed a fleet of 22 ships dropping out of FTL at a distance that Reyes' mental math put at approximately 22 minutes, and her face had the expression of someone who has opened a familiar book to a familiar page, and she said, without turning around, Mehta, confirm lower-level status, and Mehta said, confirming, and moved to a console, and Akafer said, Martinez, I need the full array warmed up in 12 minutes. And a woman across the room said, 12 minutes is tight, and Akafor said, I know, and that was the end of that conversation. And Ray stood at the edge of the room with his gear on, and his mouth closed and watched the most efficient collective preparation for violence he had ever seen in his short military career unfold around him, and started, finally, to understand that he did not know what Farron Station was. Veth Salas hailed the outpost at 19 minutes out, which was earlier than standard approach protocol required, but which he did as a matter of professional style, because he had found in 11 years of raiding that the communication gap between an ultimatum and a response told him more about what he was dealing with than most censored data did. And the message he sent was the message he had refined over years into something he considered efficient, which was that the installation had 10 minutes to signal full compliance and prepare for boarding, that any resistance would be met with overwhelming force, that the safety of the station's personnel was contingent on immediate cooperation, and that he had 22 ships and no particular reason to be patient. And he settled back in his command chair and waited for the response that 11 years of experience told him to expect, which was either immediate compliance or a frantic call for backup that would not arrive in time to matter. And what he got instead, after a pause of exactly 3 seconds, was 4 words in a voice so level it sounded almost bored. And those 4 words were, "That's not going to happen." And Salas listened to them and felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was a flicker of genuine uncertainty that he immediately suppressed because 22 years of living and 11 of raiding had taught him that uncertainty in a command chair is a weakness before it is a warning. And he told himself the voice was a bluff, that 43 humans on a rock in the middle of deep space with no warships in range did not have the standing to not comply, and he ordered the first wave in, 12 ships. Because he was a professional and professionals don't send everything at once when 12 ships is already 3 times what the math requires. Reyes was watching the sensor display when the first wave came in, and he was watching Akafor's face when she watched them come. And what he saw on her face was nothing, not the careful neutrality of someone suppressing reaction, but the actual absence of any particular reaction, the face of someone looking at a situation that falls entirely within their existing expectations. And she said, to no one in particular, time on array, and Martinez said, 90 seconds, and Akafor said, that's fine, and stood with her hands still loose at her sides, while 12 Craven warships crossed the distance threshold. And then Martinez said, array is up, and Akafor said, go ahead, and nothing happened that Reyes could see on the sensor display for 3 full seconds. And then the 12 Craven ships did something that made the sensor officer at the console beside Reyes make a sound that was not quite a word. And what they did was stop. Not stop in the way ships stop when they cut drives. Not stop in the way ships stop when something damages them, but stop in the way that the sensor display showed them stopping, which was completely, simultaneously, with no visible cause and no debris and no energy signature that Reyes could identify on any spectrum the console was reading. And he looked at the display and looked at Akafor and said, and then stopped himself, because Akafor had half-turned toward him and her expression had not changed, and she said, not unkindly, you can ask, and he said, what did we just do? And she said, the mining equipment on sub-level 4 is not mining equipment. And then she turned back to her display, and Reyes looked at Maida, and Maida looked at him and said, I'll explain later. And he understood that later meant after, and after meant this was not finished yet, which his own sensor display was already confirming, because Salas had just sent the second wave. Veth Salas stared at his sensor data for 15 seconds before he trusted it enough to act on it. And in those 15 seconds, his tactical officer said 3 things. The first being that contact with the first wave had been lost simultaneously across all 12 vessels. The second being that there was no debris field consistent with destruction, and no energy signature consistent with any known weapons discharge. And the third being that the passive sensors were showing Farron Station's power output as virtually unchanged from baseline. And Salas sat with all 3 of those data points arranged in front of him, and felt the uncertainty he had suppressed 3 minutes ago return in a form he found more difficult to dismiss. And he did what commanders do when the data stops making sense in the framework they have been using. which is reach for a different framework. And the different framework he reached for was the one that said this was an electronic anomaly, a sensor ghost produced by some form of interference technology, because the alternative framework, the one that said 12 ships were simply gone without visible cause in a way that left no trace, was a framework he was not prepared to operate inside of yet. And he sent the second wave, 8 ships this time rather than 12, because the math was shifting, and he was a professional even when he was wrong. And he watched his sensor display, and he watched the 8 ships cross the threshold, and he watched them stop. And this time, his tactical officer said nothing at all. And the bridge of Salaz's flagship was quiet in a way that had a texture to it. The texture of people who have been professional long enough to maintain their composure, but who are running out of the professional context that composure requires. In Farron Station's secondary operations room, Reyes was watching Okafor and trying to construct, from the available evidence, an understanding of what he was actually part of, and the available evidence was this. 20 ships gone in 2 waves with no visible expenditure of effort by anyone in this room. 12 minutes of calm preparation that had apparently been sufficient to render 20 enemy warships inoperable without a single person in this room raising their voice or drawing a weapon, or doing anything that looked, from the outside, like what defeating 20 ships simultaneously was supposed to look like. And Okafor standing at the center of it with the affect of a person managing a routine administrative task, giving instructions that were precise and brief, and always delivered at the same conversational volume. And around her a room full of people who had clearly done this or something like it before, who moved with the specific efficiency of training so deep it had become instinct. And Reyes thought about his orders, which said mining and research support, and thought about Maida's service record, which said administrative reassignment, and thought about the lower levels he didn't have clearance for, and assembled all of it into a conclusion that felt large and incomplete at the same time. And then Okafor said, "Martinez, what's Salaz doing?" And Martinez said, "He's on the comm again." And Okafor said, "Put it through." Salaz's voice on the comm had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been apparent to someone who had not heard it 3 minutes earlier, but Reyes had heard it 3 minutes earlier, and the change was there. A flatness to it that had not existed in the ultimatum. The flatness of someone who is choosing their words more carefully than they were before. And Salaz said that he wanted to discuss terms, that he was prepared to withdraw if the station would agree to provide full technical disclosure of the systems that had been used against his ships. And Okafor let him finish and then said, "Your ships are not destroyed." And Salaz said he was aware of that. And Okafor said, "They're suspended in a field that will decay in approximately 8 hours, at which point they'll have full function." And Salaz was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a generous outcome." And Okafor said, "It was always going to be the outcome." And Salaz said, "You could have destroyed them." And Okafor said, "Yes." And the single word sat on the channel with a weight that Reyes could feel from across the room, because yes in that context was not an agreement. It was a demonstration of the distance between what Okafor could have done and what she had chosen to do, and the distance was the point. And from the quality of the silence on Salaz's end of the channel, it was apparent that Salaz understood this, and Salaz said, "What do you want?" And Okafor said, "For you to go home and tell everyone exactly what happened here." And the channel went quiet again, and then Salaz said, "That's it," and Okafor said, "That's it." Reyes thought about that exchange for a long time afterward, and kept returning to the same point in it, which was the moment when Salaz said that's a generous outcome, because the specific quality of that phrase, the particular way it landed, told him something about what Salaz was experiencing that the sensor data alone hadn't communicated, which was that Salaz had understood something during those 2 waves that had shifted the entire frame of his experience of the engagement, had shifted it from the frame of a raid that had gone unexpectedly wrong to the frame of something else entirely, the frame of a demonstration conducted by someone who had complete control of the parameters and had chosen those specific parameters deliberately, and that understanding, that recognition that the outcome was not a lucky accident or the result of capabilities deployed at their limit, but a choice made well within the range of available options by someone who could see the whole board, was what had changed Salaz's voice. Because it is one thing to be outgunned, and another thing entirely to understand that the person who outguns you chose not to finish it, chose to let you go home, and chose to do so in a way that made the choosing unmistakably clear. And Reyes thought that if he had been Salaz, he would not have found the generous outcome as simple to receive as the word generous implied. The station returned to standard operations posture at 11:47, and Akafar filed her incident report at 12:31, and at 1300 she called Reyes to her office, which was a small room off the main corridor that contained a desk and 2 chairs and a display screen currently showing nothing, and she told him to sit. And he sat, and she sat across from him. And she said, "You have questions?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, "Which one first?" And he said, "What is this place?" And she said, "That depends on which record you're looking at." And he said, "I mean what it actually is." And she looked at him for a moment with the same quality of evaluation she had brought to the sensor display when Salaz's fleet appeared. A look that was not assessing whether to trust him, but assessing what he was ready to hear. And then she said, "It's a Tier 1 classified military installation that has been operational for 6 years under civilian cover. And the personnel here are all active-duty soldiers whose public assignment records show them in administrative and support roles, because their actual assignment is too sensitive to exist in any file that standard clearance can access. And the systems in Sublevel 4 are classified above my pay grade to fully describe to you. But the short version is that they are not mining equipment, and they have never been mining equipment. And the mining equipment story has been in the public record for 6 years, because the best cover is one that nobody is motivated to check. And Reyes processed all of this and said, "Why are you telling me now?" And Akafar said, "Because you're not leaving this posting for at least another 18 months. And because what happened today is going to be in the news cycle inside 48 hours regardless of what our communications blackout says. And because you watched it happen and you deserve a context for what you saw." And he said, "Why this posting?" And she said, "Because someone has to be here." And that was all she said about it. And he understood that was all she was going to say about it. What he came to understand over the following days, pieced together from what Akafar had told him, and what Maida was gradually willing to discuss, and what he could assemble from the pieces of context the station's less classified systems contained, was that Farron Station was one of a network of installations that existed in the gap between what Earth's publicly acknowledged military posture looked like from the outside and what it actually was. Installations that had been built with the specific understanding that the most effective deterrent is not the one that is loudly advertised, but the one that is discovered, the one that an adversary encounters in the course of doing something they assumed was safe and finds to be something other than what they expected. And the specific form of deterrence that Farron Station embodied was not the systems in Sublevel 4 alone, though those were a significant part of it, but the combination of those systems with the people who operated them, people who had been selected for this posting, not because they were the most decorated or the most publicly recognized soldiers in the human military apparatus, but because they were the most capable, the ones whose assessment records showed a consistent ability to operate in ambiguous situations with minimal guidance and maximum effect, and whose public records showed administrative postings in quiet corners of human space, because the true records were classified above the level that any standard inquiry could reach. And the effect of that combination, a real deterrent capability inside a false cover, was a specific kind of trap, one that worked not because it was hidden, but because the thing doing the hiding, the appearance of a minor civilian outpost, was exactly the kind of thing that a raider looking for an easy target would find convincing, and the trap required a springing, required someone to make the mistake of attacking, and Salaz had made the mistake, and now Salaz was going home. He left 8 hours after the second wave, his 22 ships reactivating in sequence as the field decayed, and Akafar watched the departure on the sensor display with the same expression she had worn throughout. And when the last of Salaz's fleet translated into FTL, she said, "Martinez, log the incident timestamp." And Martinez said, "Logged." And Akafar said, "Good." and walked to the galley and got a cup of coffee and stood at the observation window that looked out over the asteroid field that Farron Station sat inside. And Reyes, who had followed at a distance without fully deciding to, stood in the doorway and watched her drink it. And after a moment she said, without turning around, "You're wondering if it's always that clean?" And he said yes. And she said no. And then she said today it was, because they made the choices they made. And he said, "You knew they would." And she said, "I assessed that they probably would, and there's a difference." And he said, "What's the difference?" And she said, "One is certainty and one is preparation. And if you spend your career in certainty, you'll eventually be surprised. And if you spend it in preparation, you'll be ready when certainty fails you." And he thought about that for a while and then said, "What would you have done if the first wave hadn't stopped when the field activated, if something had gone wrong mechanically?" And she said, "I had a contingency for that." And he said, "And if that contingency had failed?" And she said, "I had a contingency for that too." And he said, "How far down does it go?" And she turned from the window and looked at him with something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and said, "Far enough," and went back to her coffee. The news broke 41 hours after the engagement, not through Earth's official communications channels, but through the Craven Information Network, which had received Salaz's preliminary report and done with it exactly what Akafar had predicted, which was not suppress it but amplify it, because the Craven Information Network ran on the same principle that most information networks in the known galaxy ran on, which was that extraordinary claims require corroboration. And the corroboration in this case was the testimony of 22 ship crews who had been present for the engagement and whose accounts aligned in every significant detail. And the detail they aligned on most precisely was not the capability, not the specific fact of what the systems in Sublevel 4 had done to 20 warships in 2 waves, but the thing Reyes had been thinking about since Salaz's channel had gone quiet, which was the choice. The fact that 43 humans in a station that looked like nothing had looked at 22 ships and responded with a demonstration rather than a destruction, had chosen the outcome that sent a message over the outcome that ended the threat immediately and permanently. And that choice, that specific deliberate choice, was the element of the account that spread fastest and changed the most about how the Craven leadership and the civilizations adjacent to Craven space thought about what they knew and what they didn't know about human installations in deep space, because it changed the question from what can they do to what have they already done that we haven't found yet. And that question, once it enters a civilization's strategic consciousness, does not leave quietly. Veth Salaz submitted his full account to the Craven Strategic Command 48 hours after the engagement in a document that ran to considerable length for a combat report, because the combat, strictly speaking, had been brief, but the account required context that the brevity of the combat did not contain, and the context was this. He had arrived at Farron Station with a fleet assembled on the basis of intelligence that described a minimal security civilian installation with negligible defensive capability. And what he had found was something so different from that description that the description and the reality shared almost no informational surface area except the physical location. And in the section of his report dealing with the post-engagement communication, he spent 6 pages on what Akafar had said and how she had said it, because the how was as significant as the what. Because the how told the reader something about the institution that had produced a person like Akafar and sent her to a posting that looked like nothing, and what it told them was not comfortable. Not for a raiding organization that had spent 11 years operating on the assumption that the legible surface of human military power was a reasonable approximation of its actual depth. And Salaz wrote in his conclusion, in language his commanding officers would later describe as unusually direct for a formal military assessment, that the Craven Strategic Command should operate from this point forward on the assumption that any human installation in deep space, for which their intelligence showed minimal defensive capability, was an installation for which their intelligence was incomplete, and that the absence of evidence of capability was not evidence of absence, and that the lesson of Farron Station was not about the capability itself, but about the distance between what that capability had chosen to do and what it had been capable of doing. And that distance was the thing that required the most serious consideration, because it described not just a weapon but a judgment. And in his experience, a weapon without judgment was manageable, and a weapon with it was something else entirely. Maida explained the posting to Reyes on the 14th day after the engagement, sitting across from him in the galley at 0200, because neither of them had been sleeping especially well, not from fear. The fear had not arrived in the way Reyes had expected it to during the engagement, and had not arrived in the days after either, but from the particular restlessness of minds that have been given large things to process, and are working through them at the pace that large things require. And what Maida told him was that she had been here 4 years and had been through 2 prior incidents, neither as large as this one. One a single scout vessel that had tried to attach a sensor package to the station's outer hull, and had been detained, and sent home with its sensor package intact, and a detailed record of exactly how the detention had occurred, and one a 3-ship probe that had come in fast and aggressive, and had been stopped at the threshold, and held for 6 hours before being released. And both of those prior incidents had produced the same effect that this one would produce, which was information entering the galactic conversation about what Farron Station was, and what it was capable of, and how it chose to use that capability. And the information accumulated over incidents and over time and changed, slowly and durably. The calculation that various civilizations made about human space and human installations, and what it cost to test the limits of human patience. And Reyes said, so it's not just a trap, it's a lesson, and Maida said, it's designed to be both. And Reyes said, whose idea was that, and Maida said, I don't know, I know it works, and he said, how do you know? And she said, because I've been here 4 years and we've had 3 incidents and not one of them escalated past the demonstration phase. And he said, and if one does, and she said, then Akafar has contingencies, and he said, that's not reassuring, and Maida said, it's not supposed to be reassuring, it's supposed to be accurate, and the difference matters. Akafar called a station briefing on day 15, all 43 personnel in the main operations room, which required some creative standing room arrangement for the larger frame soldiers in the back. And she stood at the front with no notes and no display active behind her, and said that she wanted to give the station a formal account of the engagement and its aftermath before the various rumor threads had time to become more interesting than the actual facts. Which she said in a tone that produced a brief laugh from the back of the room, and then she said what had happened in the same flat, precise language she used for everything. The timeline, the engagement, the communication with Salas, the release of the fleet, and the current intelligence assessment of the incident's impact on Craven's strategic planning, which she summarized as significant and ongoing. And then she said that she wanted to note one thing specifically, which was the conduct of the station's personnel during the engagement, and she said this without flourish, without any of the language that award citations and official commendations use, but she said it with a directness that landed harder than any of that language usually did, which was that everyone in this room had done exactly what they were trained to do and exactly what was required of them, and that the outcome reflected that. And then she said, questions, and held the floor for 20 minutes of questions that ranged from tactical to logistical to one, from a supply specialist in the 3rd row, that asked whether the incident would affect Farron Station's resupply schedule, which it would not. And then she said, good, get some rest. You've earned it, and the briefing ended, and people filed out the way they had filed in, with the easy efficiency of a group that has been together long enough to move as a unit without requiring instruction. Reyes caught Akafar at the door as the room emptied and said, I have a question I didn't want to ask in there. And she looked at him and said, go ahead, and he said, when Salas said that's a generous outcome, you didn't say anything for a moment, and I've been thinking about that pause, and she said, what about it? And he said, I think you were deciding something. And she looked at him with the evaluation expression again and said, what do you think I was deciding? And he said, whether the generous outcome was actually the right one, whether letting them go was what the situation called for, or whether you were making a call that felt right but might have costs you couldn't fully calculate yet. And Akafar was quiet for a moment and then said, that's a better question than most people would have thought to ask. And he said, is it the right question? And she said, It's always the right question, and the answer I came to is the same answer I always come to, which is that the outcome that sends the clearest signal at the lowest cost is the right outcome until there's specific evidence it isn't. And today there wasn't, and he said. And if tomorrow there is, and she said, then I'll make a different call tomorrow, and he said. And you're comfortable with that, and she said. Comfortable isn't the goal. And he sat with that for a moment and said, what's the goal? And she said, accurate, same as everything else, and went back to her office. The resupply shuttle arrived on day 22 carrying a manifest that included, along with standard provisions and equipment maintenance supplies, a sealed transfer case addressed to Akafar's personal receipt that she signed for without expression and brought to her office and did not discuss. And Reyes did not ask about it, partly because he had learned in 3 weeks what questions Akafar would answer, and what questions would be met with the kind of silence that was itself an answer, and partly because he was beginning to understand that there were layers to this posting that he was going to learn on a schedule determined by the posting rather than by his own curiosity, and that the schedule was probably the right one. And he went back to his duty assignments and his attempts to understand the systems he was gradually being cleared for, and he thought about Salaz's fleet sitting motionless in space for 8 hours, and about the 4 words that had preceded it, and about the difference between a threat and a statement of fact, and about a woman who stood in the center of an engagement that would have been terrifying from the outside, and managed it with the same affect she brought to administrative paperwork. And he thought that whatever this place was, whatever the full depth of it was that he had not yet been cleared to see, the thing it was built on, the thing underneath all the classified systems and the cover stories and the network of similar installations scattered across human deep space, was not the technology in Sublevel 4, not even the people who ran it, but something more fundamental than either, which was the judgment to build something this capable, and then decide, with clear eyes, how to use it, and to make that decision not in the heat of an engagement but before, in the months and years of preparation that preceded the engagement. Because the 41 seconds it took to stop 20 ships was not where the real decisions had been made. The real decisions had been made long before Salaz ever pointed his fleet at a mining station on the edge of nowhere. Made in rooms and briefings and planning sessions that Reyes would probably never have clearance to read. Made by people who understood that the most important choice in any conflict is not what you do when the engagement starts, but what you decide before it does. About what you're willing to do and what you're not, and about what you want the person going home to be able to say. Salaz went home, and he said it, and people listened, and the galactic conversation about human deep space installations changed in ways that were slow and durable and difficult to reverse, because the specific combination of elements in his account, the capability, the restraint, the choice, and the 4 words that preceded all of it, that's not going to happen in a voice that sounded almost bored, was a combination that didn't fit any existing threat model cleanly, and therefore couldn't be processed the way existing threat models were processed, couldn't be slotted into the familiar categories, and assigned a familiar response. And the unfamiliarity was its own message, a message that said the people who built this place and staffed it, and decided how it would respond to exactly this situation had thought about it more carefully than you thought about attacking it. And that the gap between those 2 levels of thought was exactly the size of the gap between what you expected to find and what you found, and the gap was large, and the gap was, from this point forward, going to be part of the calculation. Reyes completed his first full month at Farron Station on a Tuesday, and marked it by finishing the system's orientation manual for Sublevel 3, which was as far down as his current clearance went, and by sitting in the observation bay at 0300 and looking at the star field the way Akafar looked at it, not with the watching of someone who expects something, but with the waiting of someone who knows that when something comes they will be ready. And he thought that the waiting was a skill like every other skill at this posting, something that looked from the outside like nothing in particular, and was from the inside the result of preparation so complete that the readiness was always already there. And he sat with that thought until his shift started and then went to work. And outside the observation window the stars held their positions, patient and indifferent, and somewhere in the direction of Craven space, a fleet commander was writing a report. And somewhere in Earth's quiet bureaucracy, someone was reading it. And Farron Station sat in its asteroid field and looked like nothing, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like, and exactly the most dangerous thing it could be. Here is the question for you, and I want you to think about it before you answer in the comments below. If you were designing a deterrent like Farron Station, would you build it to be found, the way this one was, or would you build it to stay hidden forever? And which one do you think actually keeps the peace longer?